Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Forum News Service 2021 Conversation with the Legislative Leaders. I'm Dana Ferguson. We're going to be getting our conversation going shortly. We have several reporters and leaders still tuning in, so please bear with us as we get up and running this morning. Thank you for being here, and we hope we'll get a lot of important questions answered for you. Just a reminder, for reporters, if you'd like to record and don't have that permission yet, please let us know and we can make sure you get that permission. If you are not talking, please be on mute. I know it's easy to forget to turn the mute on or off, but it helps us all if we can try to prioritize those who are talking or asking questions. For reporters who are going to want to ask a question, please let me know in the chat. We're going to prioritize Greater Minnesota reporters first, and then move to anybody else who'd like to ask a question. I don't want to say limit your follow-ups, but try to keep it to one subject so we can get as many questions in as we can. Yeah, other than that, I hope you're all having a wonderful day. I'm keeping a list of everybody coming in for questions, so thank you for doing that. We're going to try to get up and running right at 10 or as close as we can to that time. Another reminder, if you don't yet have recording privileges and would like them, let us know in the chat and we'll get them to you as quickly as we can. And thanks to everybody who's requested to put in a question. I'm taking you all down right now, so hopefully get up and running. Good morning, Governor. How's it going?
Good morning, everyone. Going well. Glad to see you all here, and thank you for making this possible virtually. We appreciate it.
Certainly. We're going to wait just a couple more minutes, make sure we have all our leaders on the call. And then we're going to get up and running at 10 or as close as is possible. Reminder for my colleagues, let us know if you need permission to record or if you would like to ask a question. We are going to prioritize Greater Minnesota reporters. So as much as we can, we're going to do that. And then we're going to get to anybody else who has a question thereafter. Yeah. So I see we have the governor, Leader Gazelka's on, Leader Kent is on. We're waiting for Leaders Hortman and Doubt to get on. And it sounds like they're just trying to get on their cameras here. Good morning to you all. Again, thank you for being here.
Good morning.
Once we have all four of our leaders ready to go, we're going to kick off here. A reminder, if you are not talking, to please place yourself on mute. And I know it's sometimes hard to remember, but if you start talking again and it is your turn, take yourself off mute. The new rules of Zoom make it a little tricky, but hopefully we can all hang in there. And for those who weren't here when we mentioned it earlier, we're going to try to run about 1 hour so that the Senate leaders can get back in time to get to the floor for the 11 o'clock floor session. So we're going to do our best to stick with that timeline. If we have some run over questions, I hope they will grant us a little bit of leeway to get those questions answered. I know that Minnesotans have a lot of questions they're hoping to have resolved today. Certainly a lot going on in our state. If we have leaders Doubt or Speaker Hortman get on the call and I'm not seeing them, if you could please just let me know so that we can get off and running as soon as possible. I think there might have been a little bit of delay getting on their computers this morning. We may have to take off a couple minutes before they're able to get on, if they're not able to join right away. A great comment from colleague Peter Callahan, who says house time, making fun of the common Senate time.
That's definitely true.
I was going to say, thank you for noticing.
Both Senate leaders are here, so kudos to you. If anybody has any other clever jokes or puns, now would probably be a good time. Get them out ahead of time.
Can I ask one while we're waiting?
Sure.
Governor, do you care about this civics? The Swedzinski and Erdahl, I think, have a bill on making civics mandatory or testing for it, or with the stuff of last week, I wonder if it might be a good, timely thing.
Well, I've taught civics in high school, so I've done this. I've done government classes. I think certainly having our students have a good grounding in the history and understand what it means, but it's always like anything we do, it's in the details of this, and from the school district perspective of how do they do it? How does it look as a mandate to them of what they're already doing? Because I think one of the things to keep in mind is we have been teaching this. There is a pretty robust curriculum around the social sciences. But I do think it opens up the question that a broadening of our social science curriculum, and certainly here in Minnesota to include Indigenous history, some of the issues around racial history might be a part of that too. So I think it'll be a conversation that will probably, I don't want to speak for the legislature. I think they will probably talk about it, but I think if there is something that comes out of that, it will probably be more inclusive around the standards.
I suppose, Senator Gazelka, it's controversial as to what this curriculum would include, I suppose.
Well, let me just say the first answer is yes, I think we should. If we don't know our past, the good, the bad, and the ugly, we don't know where we're going. But you know, the Constitution, Declaration of Independence, Bill of Rights, Federalist Papers. I mean, there's so many things that were at the foundation of who we are and how processes work. And I think that would be incredibly valuable, but certainly the bad and the ugly as well. So, but I think it's a good idea.
Interesting.
Eric, if you feel good about that, I think we have all of our leaders on now. And so I'd like to get us formally kicked off. Welcome everyone to our virtual 2021 Forum News Service conversation with the legislative leaders. We certainly appreciate all of you being here. For those who are just joining us, we have with us today Governor Tim Walz, Senate Majority Leader Paul Gazelka, Senate Minority Leader Susan Kent, House Speaker Melissa Hortman, and House Minority Leader Kurt Doubt. And we also have several of my colleagues in the Minnesota Press Corps reporting pool, along with reporters from all over the state of Minnesota. We're so grateful they can be here and take the time with us. We're going to take a variety of questions this morning, starting with questions from our greater Minnesota colleagues. They don't get as many questions into some of these leaders, and we want to make sure that they get some of those questions answered for their readers, viewers, and listeners. And so if anybody has a question, please put your name in the chat. We'll try to get as many in as we can. Reminder, if you're not talking, please turn on your mute. If you'd like to talk, please turn off your mute so we can hear you. And as we wait for some questions to come in, I have a first one for Senator Gazelka and for Leader Doubt. Wondering if you can tell us what steps you might take to hold accountable some of the members who have been involved in the Storm the Capitol rallies or used language to incite some of the folks that have been involved in violence at the Capitol and beyond.
Well, none of my members were there, but I think any peaceful protest we should allow. If there's rhetoric that threatens violence in any way, it should be condemned. And frankly, I don't care whether it's a city council member or a president or a lieutenant governor or a governor or a legislator. Anybody that isn't condemning the violence that we had throughout the summer, month after month, destruction of public properties, tearing down of statues, ruining precincts, or the federal Capitol, any of that, all of us should say is un-American, period. And if we can do that, if we're all the people that I would say recognize how valuable and precious our country is in following the laws and being a country that governs under laws, we have to remind everyone, watch the rhetoric, and all of us condemn every single one of them, not just one side. I'm amazed at how one side will see nothing but flaws in the other one and see nothing wrong with what happened on their side. I don't care what side you're looking at. And so that's where I'm at. But I don't think any of my folks were there that I'm aware of.
Leader Doubt.
Yeah, thank you. Appreciate the question. You know, obviously, this country, is founded on basic rights, and one of those rights is the right to peacefully protest. And I think we have to protect that right and make sure that people always have the opportunity to do that. But I also think we have to speak out against violence, against rioting, against looting, by whoever does that. And the protest that was here at the Minnesota Capitol apparently was 100% peaceful. I think I don't know if it was organized by the same people that organized the one in DC or what the connection was, but a few members went to that. They certainly had some concerns about election results and wanted to participate in that. There was nothing here that happened that was violent or, as far as I know, even incited any violence. But we as a party have spoken out strongly against what happened in DC. We will continue to do that. That is absolutely unacceptable. And we need to join in having that conversation together. But we also need to protect people's right to peacefully protest, and not just in Washington, D.C. or here in St. Paul, but earlier in the summer in Minneapolis, those that were peacefully protesting, we need to protect their right to do that. And we need to listen and listen to people on the other side of the aisle or who we may not agree with and understand why do they feel so passionate that they would want to gather together and protest, whether that's pray or, whatever they're doing. As long as it's peaceful, we need to support that and encourage that sort of behavior. And most importantly, we need to listen to those people. And we can't we can't just listen to one side or the other. That's part of the problem with why we're so divided in this country is we only listen to the people we agree with and we tend to dismiss the people we don't agree with. And that's wrong. So I listened all summer long while there was rioting and protesting here in Minneapolis. I hope that we as leaders can come up with public policy to make this state feel like it's more inclusive and that everybody has the same opportunities and rights and everybody feels protected. And those who don't, we need to listen to them because that's important. And likewise, it's important to listen to anybody who was peacefully protesting over the weekend and try to understand why they were doing that.
There were individuals at that rally who threatened state leaders and judges. Is it appropriate for candidates, for legislators, for other people to be making comments like that? Does there need to be additional investigation into members who were there and who were encouraging that kind of comment?
First of all, we don't know if any members who were there were encouraging those sorts of comments. I am not aware of those comments. I'd be certainly interested to hear what they were. But if somebody was making a threat, that's illegal. It needs to be investigated. Those people need to be prosecuted and they need to be held accountable for that. That's unacceptable in a democracy. And that goes beyond peaceful protest. While we need to speak out very strongly against violence, against anything like that, we also need to protect the right to peacefully protest. And you can't have it both ways. If the peaceful protests over the summer were okay, the peaceful protests now are okay. If the violence now is wrong, the violence over the summer was wrong. And we need to join together, which Republicans have denounced both, and we're going to continue to denounce both.
Well, Dana, I don't know why in particular you addressed the question just to the Republican leaders, but I think it's important to note that I think you're right that an investigation needs to take place about exactly what was said. I don't have all of the information right now, but I will tell you that we're investigating whether there were members of the Minnesota House of Representatives who advocated for, incited, or supported acts of domestic terrorism. I do know that there were speakers at the rally who advocated for civil war and for casualties. What we don't have now is a complete recitation of all of the things that members of the Minnesota House of Representatives said at that rally. It's quite a different thing to ask your country to live up to its potential than to advocate for the overthrow of the legal systems in your country. And so we will be taking a very close look at what the members who were at those rallies said and did and what was going on in DC. We absolutely have a right for freedom of speech, but that stops at incitement to domestic terrorism.
Yeah, and we should, and this goes both directions. And we are condemning all acts of violence. And if there is rhetoric that is inciting people to do damage, the candidate who's now a House member multiple times, having said things, it concerns me. It concerns me on both sides when people take this to extremes. And my hope is that the leaders will begin to set an example about how we together condemn all acts of violence, all rhetoric, that we don't make excuses for anyone because of any reason. And I think Minority Leader Dowd, when he talked about it, I think it's really important that we listen to each one of these groups. Why are they doing what they're doing? I spent a lot of time over the summer, at least 10 times, having conversations in Minneapolis and St. Paul with a number of different groups about why things were happening the way they were. And it is my hope that there will be more people listening to why people feel like the election wasn't fair, why they feel like it was frustrating that the big tech companies and some of the media did filter out some of the information. And so it doesn't feel like many, even when polled, that it was a fair election. So I think listening right now is really important. But I also think leadership, that means all of us, all the leaders on this call, that we figure out how we're united against things that are clearly un-American and try to navigate away from making this a political thing, but recognizing that, frankly, there is deep unrest to the left and to the right that we need to figure out.
I want to weigh in on this too, if I might. I agree that fundamentally there's a difference between, as we've discussed, peaceful protesting and a right to free speech, but we also know that there are well-recognized limits on that speech when it comes to inciting violence and terrorism. And this isn't just a matter of what's going on here in the state of Minnesota. It was clear that leaders within the administration, President Trump himself, his attorney, his family, were using very insightful language. And I think we may need to make sure that we all stand strong and say that that's unacceptable, and that here in Minnesota, we're going to set a completely different tone. And I also think this conversation about the issue that underlies this entire episode that we're looking at right now, which is this questioning about the election, is a real problem. Basically, those have been allegations of allegations of allegations. There have been at least 60 court cases, all but one of which were dismissed for lack of evidence. And because so many millions of Americans now believe, because they have been told by their leaders that this election was rigged and unfair, they're reacting and responding to that. And we have to recognize that we have a real responsibility to deal with facts, to deal with truth. We can listen to their questions, but we can't perpetuate this, for political purposes, myth making, because we see the video that is coming out, and fortunately we're hearing more and more Republicans in Congress speak out against it directly. But this was horrific, and this is what comes of it when we allow this to go too far. And so I think it's important that we all stand up and speak together clearly in one voice about not just the violence, which we absolutely all agree with, but inciting violence and making sure that we're watching our rhetoric, that we are not enabling real misinformation within our communities.
And let's not be confused.
There's no question that the country is divided right now. And you know, I think what we need to do as leaders on a bipartisan fashion is figure out how to come together. It wasn't 6 months ago when we had a current member of the legislature stand in a police officer's driveway and use words personally himself, it's all on video, inciting violence, beating an effigy of that police officer and his wife, threatening to go and burn down communities in this state. That was right from the lips of a current state representative. And I didn't see that denounced by the leadership of his own party. And to me, you can't have it both ways. We've spent how many minutes now talking about this issue in Washington, D.C., when Democrats in this state have turned a blind eye to violence, inciting violence, protesting that is violent right in our own communities. And we together, so I will stand up and show leadership right now that I will denounce what happened in the Minnesota State Capitol if there was inciting of violence. That is absolutely 100% wrong. Those people should be held to account. But Democrats now join me in saying what happened over the summer was equally or as wrong when it happened right here in our communities by people who are members of the legislature currently.
It's really time for the minority leader to quit lying, because we were on Minnesota Public Radio together. I'm speaking together when I used the words unacceptable, inexcusable, said that I did not condone it, that I condemned it. We have to remember what's happening right now is a very different situation than freedom of speech that we didn't like this summer and that was problematic and worthy of condemnation this summer. What we're talking about is an attack on democracy. The fundamental tenets of our society are respect for the rule of law and free and fair elections. And there can be no quibbling. There can be no equivocation that it is at all correct for anybody to turn to violence as a solution to the result of an election that they don't believe in. We have a situation where we have members of the Minnesota House of Representatives who gathered at a gathering called Storm the Capitol while the United States Capitol was under assault. So you can bet we will fully investigate and find out exactly what was said and done and whether any of that was worthy of prosecution, as happened this summer. Law enforcement authorities thoroughly examined every statement that was made to determine whether any of the statements crossed the line from free speech into unlawful expressions. And in the Minnesota House of Representatives, we do not need to have members who can't accept the fundamental tenets that we are a nation of laws and we live in accordance with the rule of law, and that we accept the results of free and fair elections without violence.
I'm going to move now to a related question from Ricardo, and then Dave, you can be up next. I think you both had related questions for the leaders.
Thank you. Good morning. Yeah, I mean, it's related on this topic because I want to point out that what happened last week didn't happen in a vacuum. In fact, it's been many weeks, since the election in the making, these claims of election fraud. And in fact, in December, there were 15 Republican lawmakers, both in the Senate and the House. There were 7 senators and the remaining were House members who signed on to a letter by Representative Steve Drazkowski, in which he said, Steve Simon knowingly and deliberately conducted an illegal election by virtue of his manipulation of the law. Unlawful actions by rogue secretaries of state should not be tolerated. Only thorough, I think it's misspelled here. Only thorough, fair elections will be the voice of the people be heard. I mean, how do those words signed on to by lawmakers not so doubts about the election, and can you once and for all both leaders talk about what these actions by their own members have contributed to this environment where we have people who truly legitimately believe that this election was stolen? I mean, can you say once and for all whether this election was conducted transparently, fairly, and lawfully?
Ricardo, a lot of people feel like it was not a fair election. If you look at Twitter saying that, or fully acknowledge that they filtered out Hunter Biden accusations of corruption, where such that almost 40% of those that voted for President-elect Biden didn't even know about it. And so that it's that kind of thing that they feel like is not fair. There's just a number of issues that have been pointed to. I think we have a process
The letter made no mention of the Hunter Biden allegations.
Let me keep going, Ricardo. We have a process that I believe works, where we allow each state to work through the process of validating an election. And then we have the Electoral College that casts the votes, and that worked. Each state had the right to present the electors that they approved, and then you had the vice president certify that or allow that to go forth. I think the process worked, but just like 4 years ago when Clinton and many folks that supported her felt like the election was stolen from her here, now you have on the other side the same issue from the other side. And anytime you have a very, very, very close election, you're going to have a lot of frustration. And I think it's important that we listen. And that is what I'm doing. And at the same time, I'm not defending bad behavior from anyone, from the president, but we've also mentioned all the other ones that I think have had bad behavior. A sitting member of our state house right now, and a whole bunch of other people that have either said things or not said things when they should have stood up. And so we've got to figure this out. I'm committed on my part. It is not just one side, though. If I hear that it's only one side, I'm going to stand up and point out all of the violence and lawlessness through months and months. And then we have this terrible day at our national capital that we have to stand up against. It's not okay. It is serious, and it grieves my heart, the whole thing. But we've got to figure out if we're not standing together. If this becomes nothing but a political circus, I'll be really disappointed, but I know that it has that potential.
Well, I'm just going to weigh in, and then I'm going to sign off because I too am incredibly disappointed in this conversation. We saw the most horrific and darkest days in our nation unfold. And let's not kid ourselves that the connections go certainly through the summer and the killing of George Floyd, certainly the rhetoric that has been used. But I, like Minnesotans, woke up Sunday to this image of a noose at the Capitol Well, supporters, there may have been some supporters in 2016 that certainly disagreed, and there was a lot of research done, as we should, but it was accepted, and they did not storm the Capitol. The election has been decided. It was free and fair. Every state did that. Just because you're angry with the result of it isn't an excuse for what's happened. And now we're seeing an equivalency. The United States Capitol was stormed by people who were intent on killing the Vice President, the Speaker of the House, and our other legislative leaders at the urging of the President of the United States. Regardless of what happened and the idea that think of any of this as peaceful, I take real umbrage with the idea that what happened here at our Capitol on Wednesday was okay, because the result of that in that language of taking the governor and his family prisoner, and there may be casualties, resulted for the first time the State Patrol entering the living quarters and removing my 14-year-old son to a safe location as he's crying, looking for his dog, wondering what's going on. And as far as condemning things, certainly that has to be there. But this denial of the rhetoric that was pushed from the president continues to be pushed, that there was a fake election to undermine our system, is simply beyond the pale. And I will take responsibilities, as I have from the beginning of being governor, when situations arise, condemning it and asking for accountability. And the idea of trying to pit us against one another and saying, talking to people, Senator, you didn't need to come to Minneapolis, St. Paul to find out what happened during that time. There were folks from Brainerd that were there. This is all of Minnesota. This is what we've been talking about, of quit trying to divide us, quit trying to divide us as a nation. And all of the talk about finding the common ground, how do we find common ground when we have people that will not say the election was fair? How do we find common ground when basic medical facts are disregarded? How do we find ground when the leadership continues to perpetrate these falsehoods? And we do have work to do. We do have work to do about racial relations. It is never acceptable. But an equivalency of a coup on the United States government, I've not heard the word. President Trump fomented sedition. It would help to hear that. Were there people in Minneapolis that illegally looted and burned? Absolutely. That's why we have brought them to justice. But it doesn't change the fact of why were those people on the streets in Minneapolis versus why were those people in the Capitol building. And I just want to make note of this. The death of a Capitol police officer, many of whom are still my friends, the undermining of the sense of security in our nation. We have members here in Minnesota who are afraid to come to work because they are afraid of the threats that they're receiving or at their homes. We have members marching on their homes. And we have work to do around education, around the environment, around the budget. But I did not expect this conversation to veer into a condemnation of a House candidate that was roundly criticized, or an idea that we're going to pretend that what happened in any way is equivalent that happened last Wednesday and what our responsibility is. Because I believed it. I believed that this was going to be the state where we came together and tackled these issues. I believed it, that we could find this common ground. I do not stand here in self-righteousness and say that there have not been folks of all political spectrums to do this, but that is a false equivalency to end the conversation we're having right now. Before the end of this week, this president will be impeached or will be removed. I am going to get on a call here very shortly with Vice President Pence, whose life was threatened in the chambers of the United States Capitol. The sense of shame, of disbelief, of horror that was witnessed by our people. Now all of a sudden we're going to say, well, both sides do this, but these people are angry because this election was rigged. Election was not rigged. The election was carried out. I've lived through elections where my side lost and I did not do this. And I, for 4 years, respectfully spoke to President Trump as the President of the United States. And we have a situation now where I can't get folks to even acknowledge that. And I just, for the press that's on here, I want to send my deep condolences, the story that's not being told. If you saw the aftermath of the Capitol Press Gallery, if you saw some of the live footage of some of the reporters that went through this, to pretend like there hasn't been a rhetoric of the evil mainstream press, I would hope that the fact checks on Twitter and the things are being done by this group to not just play the sports reporter that one side said this or one side said that, because now is the moment. Now is the moment. It is not over. We have 9 days and it will not be over after that. But here in Minnesota, if we can't agree on some basic facts, if we can't agree to come back together and figure out how to piece that, I don't know. I thought this was going to be a healing moment. It's why I look forward to coming on here. I have continued to try and find where that common ground is, but I'm candidly with you. How do we talk about reaching a compromise on a budget when we can't agree that our elections are fair? Apparently they were fair in each of the members who are on here's district. Apparently they were fair in other areas, but they mysteriously are not fair here. And we're not talking about other states. We're talking about people questioning the elections in the state of Minnesota and undermining this. I don't know how hard it is to unequivocally say this election is over and here's where we go. Any type of assault on our democracy. So I will let the rest of the questions go.
Governor, we
yeah.
have at least 2 direct questions for you before you might need to leave.
Sure.
The first from Brian Baxt, wondering if you can talk a little bit more about the letter you sent to leaders last week regarding the potential rollback of executive authority. And then another coming from Mary LaHammer after that, if you're able to stay on. And we'd like the leaders to respond to some of those things too, if they're able.
This is another place where the administration in DC has made it politically impossible for some folks to simply acknowledge there's certain things you need to do in a health pandemic, and we could fix that. And it's easier to say the governor's using unchecked powers. It's important to say this is what this means. This is a moratorium on eviction moratorium. This is a relaxing of some of our state licensing standards. This is a masking mandate. And I would remind folks again, that is something that's put out by the CDC and it's put out by the medical institutions. And I think sending that out there, I want the legislature to take these responsibilities. I want the legislature to do some of these things. But as I've said before, I have a responsibility to not allow behaviors like members gathering in unmasked closed spaces to spread the virus to go. So I thought that would be a good overture, a good start. Let the people of Minnesota understand that you saw the story that was done today. Every governor is dealing with this exact same thing. As of this morning, the state of Minnesota bars and restaurants are more open than the state of North Dakota. And so I just want there to be some clarification around that. So that was the purpose of sending the letter.
Perhaps the leader to respond. Governor, if you could give us a sense, how much time do you have?
You know, I guess it'll depend on where we go from here. I think there has to be this question that I thought was closer to being solved about uniting around condemnations of the coup attempt against our government, and then some desires of where we could go. Talking about security of members, some of those things. I'll take another question from you. Then I think we probably need to rethink how we're going to come back together. I am hugely disappointed, just to say the least.
I have a few questions for you if you're willing to take them, and then we'll turn to legislative leaders for response on some of these. The first comes from Mary, and then we're going to have Trey.
Okay, if I can jump in, Governor, before you go, because I think this is under your purview, the security of the state capitol and the January 6th rally at the state capitol and protests there. And it's been noted, yes, they were peaceful. A number of people are open carrying and, long guns out along with state troopers, and it seemed to be a good presence. What about that balance of folks who can come to the Capitol Mall, open carrying as well, and that balance of state security? And do we feel like our state capitol truly is safe and what happened in DC could not happen here?
Well, my direct responsibility, because we don't have a police force, if you will, we have the state patrol. And my two areas of responsibility are the state capitol, the residents, and the state buildings to the best of our ability on the Capitol complex. And the answer is yes. We put things in place. We were aggressive around that back in May. And so I certainly think here it is, but I want to say that talking to members of the legislature, they may feel safe here, they don't feel safe at home. This idea of taking that, and I want to be clear, I get it, and I'm not going to get into a debate here on this, but let's just understand what open carry is about. All of us have had this. Maybe your neighbor's trees are over on your yard. So you go over and knock on the door and say, Gary, you think you could trim your trees down? You know, I'm having this issue. Your black walnut things are in my yard or whatever. We've all done these things. It's a lot different. I go to Gary's house carrying a rifle and tell him his trees are in there. And we all know why they open carry for that. It's about intimidation, whether you can or not. Heck, you can carry a chainsaw, but I wouldn't take one into McDonald's. Those are things that I think has to have a conversation about, but no one's going to say that. I got members standing in front of my house, members of the legislature, standing in front of my house next to people carrying ARs because they don't like to wear a mask. So I just leave it to the reporters on here to figure out where that common ground is.
Next question from Trey.
Thank you. Governor, House and Senate leaders, several senators last week took part in floor sessions without wearing masks, and there have been reporting of there's been reporting on other lawmakers who, have questioned mask mandates and some of the COVID requirements currently in place. Is there going to be another discussion over how these requirements are enforced? Is there any discussion over what responsibility lawmakers have in modeling the regulations that are currently going on in the state? I was hoping for a little bit of perspective on where you all are at with the COVID regulations and what needs to stay and what needs to go.
So
we are not. Part of what makes it difficult for us to move on and have this conversation about sharing power with the governor to make decisions related to COVID-19 is this fundamental difference of approach that you see in the House and the Senate, and how important it is for us to follow the basic science of stopping transmission of this disease and protecting people on the staff and members. In the Minnesota House of Representatives, we have a very strict rule. You must have a mask in all places at all times. If you're an employee, you'll be subject to discipline up to and including termination if you don't comply with the policy. Members will not be recognized on the floor if they're not wearing a mask. If they persist in not wearing a mask, they will be subject to ethics complaints and processing through the ethics committee up to and including censure and expulsion. But you see the very major difference we have in approaches to dealing with COVID-19 between the House and the Senate. And the biggest question I get is, why do we keep upholding the governor's peacetime emergency power? And the reason is, this is a governor who believes in science and who is taking measures to protect the lives of Minnesotans, as we are in the Minnesota House of Representatives. Now, I hope that this session, we will be able to get to a point where we're all working together to manage COVID-19 responsibly. But when you see that difference on something so basic and so fundamental about protecting human beings' lives as these different approaches on masking policy, it starts to explain to you the difficulty that we'll have in governing the state together with regard to COVID-19.
So we believe in using the science and data as well. We just feel like there are times that the governor has misinterpreted it and gone in a direction that was not helpful. And then secondarily, in the Senate, we strongly encourage people to use the mask, which most people do. We practice social distancing. We wash our hands, cover our cough. If you're sick, you stay at home. And we give people the ability to be there or not be there through Zoom. And so we have not, that I'm aware of, had one infection as a result of how we handle the procedures in the Senate. But we struggle at times with where the governor wants to go, because it's this mandating of things, mandating the masks, shutting down businesses, keeping kids out of school, and we just don't think that has been the right approach. But there are so many things right now that we have to figure out how to lower the tone. I mean, the jabbing and then say, well, let's work together doesn't work real well. I can acknowledge both sides may have something that works, and we can, if we're working together, we can actually come to some really good conclusions. But the difference between strongly recommending people wear a mask and mandating a mask, frankly, most people are wearing the masks. And if you look in other states that have been less restrictive than Minnesota, the mortality rates have been lower in places like Colorado and Wisconsin with populations bigger than ours. So we're going to follow the data and science as well, but there are times that we're going to come to different conclusions. In the very beginning, when the governor made a choice to shelter at home everybody, I had suggested that we just shelter at home seniors, and we didn't know, but the data was there to say that would have produced the same result. So using the data is important, following the science is important, but you know that you can come to different decisions based on following that. Even Dr. Osterloh has come to different conclusions 2 or 3 times through this pandemic, where he believes one thing following science and then changes that later, and that's okay. But figure out how to lower the tone as we're working together is a really good idea right now.
The problem with saying we need to lower the tone, and this is specific to the Minnesota Senate, is that the behavior of members of one caucus who, for whatever their reasons are, I don't pretend to be able to read their minds here, but do not appear to take seriously that masks would make a difference, are incredibly disrespectful to members of the minority party and of nonpartisan staff who do take it seriously and are mocking in some cases, and completely dismissive. And so I agree. I think we should be able to work together. I hope we can continue to have conversations. I appreciate that Senator Gazelka and I are working together, setting up a working group involving a bunch of people so that we can ask these questions. But it matters. It absolutely matters in our ability to work together on these issues when it is clear that one group of people simply doesn't take it seriously, as manifest through their behavior and the way they treat other people in the Senate. How we can have the kind of trust we need in order to get to these resolutions.
I think one thing we could do is not just kind of bunch everybody into a, my caucus has been very actively wearing their masks, and including when we speak. I do it, even though the governor doesn't wear a mask when he speaks at a press conference, and I don't think he necessarily should, as long as the social distancing. Please don't take that as a criticism. I just meant that, my caucus is actually going above and beyond to follow those rules. And we do it because we have respect for other people's safety. While I don't, and I'm not concerned about myself with COVID, I'm not in a high risk category. I still owe it to my colleagues to make sure that I'm respecting if they may have somebody, and they may have somebody at home that I don't even know about who's a high risk person. So that's why we do it. And I frankly have told all of my members, if you're going to be on the floor, you're going to have a mask on. You're going to have a mask on when you're speaking on the floor. I'd like to see us ease those rules so you could remove your mask just when you're speaking. I don't think I realized how hard of hearing I am and how much I rely on seeing people's lips, but I have a tough time hearing people when they're speaking on the House floor if they've got a mask on, and I can't see their lips moving. So maybe other people have that problem too. But one thing that I think we can do is just not make blanket assumptions about people on the other side. If we're really serious about being leaders and coming together, I think we need to assume the best of each other and not the worst. It comes across as politicizing an issue, and I hope that's not the case, but I think we really need to do a better job of just not assuming the worst about each other.
I'd like to move to the next question from Kevin, followed by a question from Dave.
Senator Gazelka, I'm a little confused at the statement you just made a moment ago that Senate policy has not resulted in any infections. It seemed that 4 infections resulted from potentially a caucus meeting and then a party at which people were apparently not wearing masks. Clearly, I wasn't there, so I can't speak to that. But is that really true what you said? Did Senate policies truly not result in any infections, and in fact, perhaps even one death?
On the Senate floor, practicing social distancing, washing your hands, covering your cough, strongly suggesting wearing a mask there's been no infections from our day-to-day activities at the Capitol. As far as the event where there were some infections, virtually everybody came in wearing a mask as the food and beverages were given out. People take off their masks to do that, which is legal. And I believe that's likely when there was some infection. But frankly, we don't even know. There was election evening events that also happened 2 days before. But all of the processes on the Capitol grounds, nothing that I'm aware of has caused an infection.
If I can follow up just very briefly, since you don't know, you can't be clear how these infections happen. Doesn't it make sense to go ahead and affect a mandate?
No, we don't believe that mandating masks is the right way to go. We think strongly encouraging is. I think most people wear a mask. If you're going to go into any place, you should be wearing a mask. I wear a mask. But I've had COVID, which means it's highly unlikely that I'm going to be spreading it or getting it from somebody. But somebody on this call mentioned that people are afraid, and if I can show respect, then I'm going to. But that's where I'm at on it.
Thank you.
Moving on to a question from Dave, followed by a question from Theo.
Yeah, I'm sorry to take us back to an area that didn't seem to go well, but I really. Majority Leader Gazelka and Minority Leader Dow, we have to get back to this. You both know, I believe, that the presidential election was not stolen for Donald Trump, and many members of your caucuses know this also. You just have yet to say so publicly, and I'm wondering, given the recent events, and given how many of your supporters believe this falsehood, will you now acknowledge that it's false, that Joe Biden is not just the result of the Electoral College, but is the duly elected president?
Well, if you recall, David, you asked me that last week, and I said Biden is going to be the duly elected president-elect, and that the process worked. I acknowledge that there were some things that I didn't feel like were fair, but I do think in Minnesota, for example, I do believe that Biden won in Minnesota. People don't like the process, but I do like the fact that each state controls the destiny of that state, and the whole process worked. And so you asked me last week, and the Electoral College voted in early December, and that settles the issue. The court, there's nothing wrong with asking questions and probing about why things happened the way they did. And that's the process we had. That's why things went before the courts. I think the courts looked at it and said, you have to show convincing proof, and they couldn't show that. So the process worked, and the transition of power worked. And I've been saying that as well. I think that's important. So I've been saying since the Electoral College voted that Biden is president-elect.
And just to clarify, and that claims to the contrary are false?
What do you mean?
I mean that claims to the contrary. I mean, supporters of you are emailing me this morning saying you guys still won't cover the fraud that this election was stolen. These are people who believe in what is essentially a lie. And I'm wondering if you'll call it out.
I'm going to let you do your job, David, I have made the public statements. I put it on my Facebook right after December about 6th about what I think happened and that the process is in place to make sure there's a peaceful transition of power. You're going to have to do the digging.
I want to chime in on this one as well. I had made statements weeks ago that Biden was the president-elect and that he was going to be the president. I don't think anybody's foolish actions, either here in St. Paul or in Washington, D.C., were going to change that. While I did speak out that people have a right to peacefully protest, what I want to talk about right now is how we move forward from here. We've heard a lot of talk about us coming together, and I think that's incumbent on us as leaders to try to figure out how to do that. And what that means is that we don't get to just decide if people are wrong and that they shouldn't, they shouldn't have the opinion that they have. What we need to do as leaders is recognize that there is a swath of our population that believes that the election maybe wasn't fair, or that, the result wasn't, fair. What we need to do is instill confidence back into them that our system is fair. And that doesn't mean ignoring their concerns. It means listening to them and finding out why. I do know, and I think we have to take some action to put some things in place in our state to make sure that people do have confidence in our elections. And what I mean by that, I'm going to talk about just one instance in the state of Minnesota. Our Secretary of State came to an agreement with the legislature in committee. We passed that agreement into law on the House floor and on the Senate floor, and the governor signed it into law with the Secretary of State's agreement. The Secretary of State then went into court and agreed with somebody who sued him that was absolutely contrary to that agreement he made with us. Then all of a sudden there was nobody in court to defend our viewpoint. That thing got overturned, and now all of a sudden the courts were determining election law. This is the sort of thing that people are frustrated about, and I think Secretary of State Simon has some relationship building to do, because I think he lost some trust with legislators. Whether it's true or not, I think there is a belief that people thought that he was actively recruiting people to sue him so that he could join on their side of that lawsuit and get things overturned. That's one thing if you want to do that, but when you're doing it on something where you actually literally agreed and supported legislation that went through, and then you reversed your position in court and got something overturned, then you're circumventing the legislature. And the Constitution does require that state legislatures set the means for elections. So, was there election fraud in this election? Absolutely there was. There's been election fraud in every one. Was there enough to overturn the results of the election? I don't believe so. And when I say there was election fraud, I'm talking about, did a few people vote here and there that shouldn't have, or whatever? Of course, everybody knows that. That happens in every election. But that wasn't enough to overturn the results of the election. There are people, however, believe that in certain circumstances that things were done to change election law to circumvent state legislatures. It happened right here in Minnesota. I don't think that was right. I don't think it should have happened that way. Would that have changed the election results here in Minnesota? I don't think so. But our job as leaders is to get people to come together and pass whatever we need to instill confidence in our election system so that Minnesotans believe our elections are secure and the outcomes are valid. And I'll remind you that 4 years ago, Democrats spent a fair amount of time trying to convince everybody that the Russians had hacked into the election and that our election results shouldn't have been valid, and not believing that President Trump won. The reality is President Trump won 4 years ago. I think everybody in this country should try to understand why that happened and why people were so upset that they put him in place. And this time, President-elect Biden won. And I think we should all spend some time trying to figure out why that happened and why people put him in place, and try to understand each other. And if we spent more time trying to understand each other and the other side, this country would be a lot better place.
I, for one, am not going to spend any time trying to understand a person who killed a Capitol Hill police officer and tried to destroy our democracy. I, for one, am not going to try and spend a lot of time to figure out why a president of the United
Governor,
States.
I have spoken out against that many times on this phone call. I sent a statement to the Star Tribune that they did not print. I can't speak out in stronger terms that is absolutely wrong. You and I agree on that. And I would really appreciate if you don't try to insinuate that somehow I or anybody associated with the Minnesota House of Representatives or the Minnesota Senate in any way condones that behavior. We do not, and we speak out against it in the strongest terms. It's absolutely unacceptable.
Well, I'll reclaim my time. You don't need me to make that connection. The public will make that connection. But I'm going to just end and sign off this. You can see the depth of the problems that we have. This is supposed to be a forum that would be fact checked. That Senator Gazelka, I know you're upset on this, but we've got to get some things done. But the fact of the matter is, a president that this caucus, your caucus, fully supported, asked for a rebellion against the United States. But we would rather debate separate issues. We would rather do both sidesism. We would ever make the case. Wouldn't matter if the constant rhetoric that we not follow some basic science principles. So I'll leave it to the press. This is where you do your best. Fact check the statements that were made here. Try and figure out. Again, I would leave you with the idea that there was a noose and a gallows outside the United States Capitol. We are lucky we didn't lose more people there. Trying to cater to understand to why people, we should understand why they think this election was flawed, is part of the reason that they were in that Capitol. And I refuse to partake in that straw man fight or what I consider to be some pretty epic gaslighting going on amongst all of us. The good news is, I never think it's a good idea to try and gaslight the press. So I'll let you decide from there and we'll go. So thank you.
And I need to make some closing arguments that I have to get onto the floor. And I really do think it's important we lower the tone. I mean, there are a number of things going on that we've got to figure out how to navigate through. The fence around the state capitol is here, and the picketing around all the many people that got their places picketed, myself, Speaker Hortman, the governor, and others, happened long before what happened today. And so we have to figure out how to lower the tone here. We have to figure it out. You can call me if you think I'm gaslighting, but I'm actually just trying to condemn it all. What happened in Washington, D.C. was tragic from the top all the way down, and yet the process worked. That is the good news, is the process worked. But I'm just saying we should be looking much broader. There's a lot of stuff going on, and if we don't figure out how to do it together, we're in serious trouble. I got to go. Thank you, guys.
Quickly, Senator Gazelka and Senator Kent, before you have to sign off, wondering if you can respond to the governor's letter from last week, goalposts being set up for emergency powers coming down. Your thoughts on that?
It wasn't helpful. I put out an op-ed that I told him about days ahead of time about how I thought we could get out of this together, and that would be that at some point of getting the vaccination out, he would be willing to give up emergency powers. 1B, which is 75 and over, 1C, which is 65 and over. Is there some place that he's willing to give up emergency powers? I mean, we got to get kids back in school. We got to get back to some sense of normal. And I think getting the vaccine out is where we can all agree. And so that's the direction I think we should go. Putting out a list of things that he wants to get, that he won't give up. And so he's going to keep emergency powers, I think is unfortunate. But we will continue to do our best to get the budget done. I do believe we can get it done. But I think emergency powers on and on and on has really driven a wedge among many people in Minnesota. Thank you.
Thank you.
Dana, if I can respond to that. I have spoken about this quite a bit. I think there is definitely opportunity for the legislature to work with the executive branch and craft some solutions. And I appreciate in principle what Majority Leader Gazelka is saying about the vaccine, but the reality is we're getting 65,000 doses a week right now, and it's going to take a very long time until we even get through 1B at that rate. So we're struggling with the reality of the production and the delivery of those injections, never mind getting them into people's arms. And so, how we approach this needs to be a conversation. I appreciate that the governor laid out some of his thoughts as a starting point for that discussion. I think it's unfortunate and I think this is another case where messaging is out there that is feeding an inaccurate understanding in the public. People just keep saying executive powers and without understanding all of the details and the levels that are included in the executive orders that have been put forward. And there's plenty of opportunity, and the Senate Republicans who run this place can pass any bill they want. If they want it to get passed through the House and then signed by the governor, they would do well to work with them. But to just sit there and keep complaining and arguing that we can't that we don't have a seat at the table just doesn't pass the smell test as far as I'm concerned, when they could pass anything that they think makes sense and get it through the system that as we've all declared how much we believe in the Constitution today, the system that is established by our Constitution.
Thank you. And sorry,
Sure.
if we're allowed to keep you on and keep Leader Doubt on for a couple more questions, we'd sure appreciate it.
Sure. And I'd just like to
if you have to
briefly
go, let us
respond.
know.
Yeah, I'd like to briefly respond to the governor's letter. I mean, we're at a tough place when the Senate Majority Leader is taking umbrage at the governor communicating with him to try to start a conversation about how we can work together. Where we are going to be able to do some good work is on the topic of what is currently in the executive orders that is causing tension for people. The emergency powers themselves is a toolbox that we are unwilling to take away from the governor because we don't know what tools he's going to need. This pandemic, now we have the more deadly strain here in Minnesota. We don't know how facts are going to change and how he'll have to respond. When we look at some of the executive orders that are creating the tension and the problems, and if we start to try to work on those specific subject areas, that's where we're going to be able to make progress, whether it's the eviction moratorium or, we're going to have federal money coming from DC that we're going to have to get out in the form of rental assistance. So we'll be having conversations with each other about, are there some modifications that we could all reasonably agree and the governor would be willing to sign into law? So when we think about the governor's use of emergency powers under Chapter 12.31, it's not a light switch, it's a dial. And there's not just one thing. It's not either he has them or he doesn't. Let's use the legislative process, put together some really good proposals that address different areas like housing or vaccinations or education. Let's have the legislature prove that they are capable of bipartisan action to put plans together that are superior to what currently exists in an executive order. And I'm certain that the governor would be happy to sign those into law. That's where I think we're going to have fruitful conversations. And I do want to say in the House, I very much appreciate that Minority Leader Doubt has been very strong on the public health issue of the mask wearing. We're building common ground together. We are working towards a way where we can come to a solution together on the governor's Chapter 12 powers. Representative Gene Pawlowski will be leading the effort in the Minnesota House of Representatives. He's already working closely with Barb Haley. The Minority Leader Kurt Doubt and the Majority Leader Ryan Winkler have had conversations, and we expect to be having very serious, very bipartisan conversations soon, as soon as we can get language that we can all take a look at, so we can hopefully kind of dial down the heat that comes from this conflict of the governor's emergency powers, get past that and start working on all the other things that we need to do together.
Leader Doubt.
Thank you. I'm not sure I even know what the question was, but I'm going to just comment on what I heard. And I very sincere apology. My computer lost internet connection and just went out completely. So it took me a few minutes to get back in. I wasn't trying to bail on you all. So I appreciate your indulgence in letting me get back on. On the emergency powers issue, I've been a very strong advocate that the legislature needs to be involved in the process. I think others have tried to paint that as that I don't care about safety or I don't think COVID's a real thing. That isn't the case at all. What I am frustrated about is that frankly, we have not had hearings in the Minnesota House on any of this stuff. And all of a sudden, we're talking about ending the emergency powers or how to do so. And it's like, we've had 10 months to deal with this. And the fact that we've taken no action to prepare for this moment, almost, there's almost no other way you can look at that, but to say that, Democrats have been blocking to allow the governor to have his emergency powers, because really, it's up to us to rise up and show that we're capable and ready to take on some of this leadership. As far as the governor's letter itself, I just think it was tone deaf in the aspect that the legislature needs to act. The legislature needs to have hearings. The legislature needs to decide for itself what things need to be put in place. And we don't need to be offered an ultimatum from the governor about what those things should or shouldn't be. Those are decisions. That's the separation of powers between the executive branch and the legislative branch. And that's what my main concern is about all of this, is that the governor's been acting unilaterally without legislative consent on many, many things. Now, we did get the appropriation authority back just by way of statute. The fact that we're back now in session means that we now have the purse strings again. So the ways of the governor kind of going around us are not in effect now while we're in session. But we still do need to put something in place that allows the governor to act in a reasonable way and respond in a reasonable way, but also forces the legislature to have hearings and to be involved in the decision-making process. And that to me is returning to kind of what the Constitution, I think, has defined as a co-equal branch of government. I do want to say also, I'm a little disappointed, and I'm really trying to cut my rhetoric down because I sometimes can be a little aggressive. But the reality is our country is incredibly divided right now, and we need to kind of measure our words and we need to understand each other. I can't tell you how many times I've said that on this call, but we need to listen to each other. And I'm disappointed that our governor really isn't willing to listen to people who might think the election was not fair. I'm not saying it wasn't fair. I'm not saying I agree with them. I don't get to choose what people believe or they don't. It just like we had to listen to folks who were concerned that police were endangering their lives and not keeping them safe. And those are very valid concerns and things that we absolutely must listen to. We also need to realize that there's a certain percentage of our population that needs some confidence that our elections are fair and that they are secure. And so those are little small steps that we can take. And what I saw in the governor's words were that he doesn't even want to listen to people that disagree with him. And what the most important thing that we as leaders right now need to do is bring people together. And in order to bring people together, we need to listen to them. You're not going to bring anybody together if you refuse to listen and if you leave phone calls early or press calls early because you don't like the conversation. The reality is if I were to say there's a criticism that I have of this governor, and I don't mean this in a political sense. I mean it in a very productive, constructive sense that I want this governor to be better and I want him to be successful. But the reality is this governor, the one weakness that he has is he doesn't listen to enough people and he doesn't listen to differing viewpoints. And so I would very strongly recommend that if he really wants to be a uniting leader, that he listen to people that disagree with him and he tried to address their concerns by putting things in place that will restore confidence in our systems. And that's what we all have to do. And I'm going to pledge myself to do that.
It has to be noted that on Wednesday, January 6, 2021, in Minnesota, on the Capitol grounds, at a rally called Storm the Capitol, the people called for casualties, and they were referring to the governor and his family, and his child was evacuated. So, I think we just have to be a little bit realistic about holding people accountable for the hate speech and not expecting the governor to ignore the fact that people are saying on the Capitol premises that there should be a civil war and there should be casualties. And by casualties, they mean him. So to ask him to turn around and, turn the other cheek and hug these people close and say, why is it that you don't think that we had a free and fair and legal election is completely unrealistic. Now, I
Yep,
will.
and I now, for about the fifth time, have denounced, and I will join you right now in denouncing that behavior, because that is unacceptable. And I don't want you to lead people to believe for 1 second that I condone that behavior. I have denounced it about 5 times on this call, and I join you in denouncing it right now.
Let's imagine for a moment somebody referred to casualties towards your family. And I want to know how warm and fuzzy you're going to feel about having a conversation with those people the next day. So let's acknowledge the reality of what happened. Now, Minnesota's Republican leaders right now have an opportunity to step up. And they have this moment where they can decide whether they are the party of QAnon or they are the party of Lincoln and Reagan. And they have the opportunity to take the leadership stance to totally reject and repudiate people who are calling for casualties, people who are calling for civil war, and people who are falsely claiming that we did not have a free and fair and lawful election in the state of Minnesota. This is an opportunity for them to help heal the state, and they need to take it. We need this from them.
I'm going to move to a few more questions before we close out. Thank you both so much for staying on with us. We really appreciate it. We're going to go to Theo, Bill, Steve, and then Shannon, hoping we can keep it quick so we're not keeping these leaders too long. I know they're busy today. Thanks.
I guess I'll just make sure, did the governor in fact leave the call? Governor, are you still on? No? Okay. That's all for me.
Thanks. Bill, you go ahead.
Yeah, my question is for the leaders who remain with us. Should the U.S. House impeach the president, and should the Senate convict him?
I'm a lawyer, and generally speaking, my approach is that these things have to be very, very carefully considered. And I'm not a legal expert, but what I heard is an incitement to overthrow the government. And if in fact what the president of the United States was doing was inciting people to take the government, to overthrow the government by force, yeah, he's not fit to serve for a single additional second.
Leader
I'm
Dowd,
going to resist the bait to defend our president. There's nothing, I can't speak in any stronger terms that what happened at the U.S. Capitol, and I guess I'm just finding out on this phone call about the threats to the governor. The press that I know of hadn't reported that yet, so I hadn't seen any of that. But of course, I denounce any of that sort of behavior and conversation in the strongest possible terms. This is absolutely unacceptable. Just as it was unacceptable that John Thompson stood in the driveway of a police officer in the state of Minnesota while threatening violence, while talking about burning communities, while beating an effigy of him and his wife. And then Democrat leaders really either delayed to stand up and call that out, or in many cases, as the governor really never did. And the governor never did withdraw his support for John Thompson as a candidate for the state legislature. So I think there has been an incredible double standard on the part of the Democrats on those issues. But I want to be very clear that there will not be a double standard on the part of Republicans. We did not stand for that sort of behavior back during the summer when it was happening. All violence, all rioting, all looting, all threats of violence are unacceptable, regardless of where they come from. And I will not defend that in any way, shape, or form.
Mr. Leader, the question is, did the president incite? And if he did, then is he no longer fit to serve for the remaining 9 days of his term? What's your answer to that, sir?
You know, the U.S. House is going to have to answer those questions. I did not watch his comments during his speech. I saw little clips of it. I've seen numerous little clips of it. I don't know what's happened behind the scenes, whether he incited it or not. I'm not going to make that determination, and I'm certainly not going to defend him.
Yeah, thank you.
A final question, if you have one, Steve. The speaker had to go. If you have a question of Leader Dowd, otherwise we're going to close it out today.
I'll actually even go a step further and say, that the the president needed to come out sooner during those riots and denounce it and call people off. And I don't think that his words were strong enough or soon enough. Any other questions for me?
Yeah, this is Steve Karnowski with AP. There have been calls by some groups that are upset about the outcome of the election for further actions at state capitals on January 16th and 17th. Are you aware of those? Are you worried about them? What do you think the response ought to be?
I am not aware of any of that. I don't know about that. You know, Minnesota was not on the list of kind of closely contested states. I think there were even the ones where the Trump campaign was contesting the election results. Our results weren't close enough that they would have been overturned by some, narrow ruling by a court. So, but, I think we at the same time need to acknowledge that if there are people in our communities that we represent who don't have confidence in our elections, that we need to take action to make sure that they do. I gave the one example of Secretary Simon agreeing with the legislature, supporting legislation that went through, literally negotiating with us, coming to agreement, and then watching that legislation go through and get signed as he supported it, and then immediately going into court and agreeing with the other side against his agreement with us. He wasn't defending that agreement. He wasn't defending the legislation that had just passed. He wasn't defending statute or law. And frankly, I think he agreed with the other side, and that was overturned. So the courts determined what our election, how that was going to be run in the state of Minnesota. And I think Secretary of State Simon has some relationships to repair, because I think there's a lack of trust now with him and many legislators. And I think that's bipartisan, actually.
If there are further actions at the Capitol, should Republican lawmakers take part in them?
And probably not, but each person and each member gets to decide what sort of protest they take part in. I know that Aisha Gomez was taking part in Antifa stuff over the summer, and while I didn't agree with it, she certainly has a right to do that as long as it's not violent. I don't know if the things that she did crossed the line into violence or rioting, but I do know that she was photographed at those sorts of events. So I think we as elected leaders just all need to come together, take a collective deep breath, start to listen to both sides equally, and start to figure out what the right path forward is to instill the sort of confidence that people in this state are subject to fair and free elections, and that people in this state are subject to law enforcement that actually protects them and that they don't feel threatened by. And those are both things that I think everybody in the state can get behind. And that's a great note to probably end this. So I've got to move on to other things as well. And I think I'm the last leader left here. So
You are. Thank you for being here.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks, everybody. Do appreciate everything that you all do. Thank you.
Great. Well, everybody, on that note, thank you so much for being here for the 2021 Forum News Service conversation with the legislative leaders. We appreciate all 4 leaders and the governor for taking the time out to be here, even if they couldn't make it for the full time. Thank you to all of my colleagues, Minnesota reporters, all the Capitol Press Corps members, and also thank you for all the viewers who are watching from home. I hope you're staying healthy and safe, and have a wonderful rest of your day, y'all.